Guys, this is Dr. Mick. Can you say hello, guys?
Hello, guys. Oh wait.
Son of a Kate, listen, you.
Oh man, we're off. We're already off to a bad start.
Man, it's ruined. It's ruined. It's good to see you, dude.
Good to see you too.
Thanks for coming along. I am like completely not set up at the moment, so you'll have to
Totally fine.
allow for
Want me to dance for everybody a little bit here?
my lack of. Look at you just dancing. He's getting down,
Hey,
guys.
I gotta keep the people entertained. That's it.
Well, there's only a couple of us. We don't have too many people here this time, so that's fine.
You're
Uh,
right. Yeah,
um,
just us.
It's just us. It's basically just us. So, guys, this is again Dr. Mick, and if I can intro you for a moment, he's a licensed family and
By
couple
all means.
therapist out of Illinois. He can only, first off, he can only treat people in Illinois. So if you're looking for a therapist and you're not there, then don't bother. But he actually does have a segment where he can help you find a therapist. But also, he is ethically bound because you are not his patients to be limited on certain questions and things that you ask that might be crossing into too much of a doctor-patient relationship. So that's where I'll step in and give my uneducated opinion, and he will sit there
Yeah.
and judge me silently. But we like to, he is a good friend of mine and someone who I feel like I got really close to really fast. And I apologize
Yeah.
if you're like, whoa, 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 back up, buddy.
No,
I,
I
I,
agree.
I need space.
I agree
Um,
completely.
but we kind of just hit it off. We clicked really well. And he is passionate about mental health, and I am passionate about mental health. He is mentally healthy, and I am not. So it's really good yin yang sort of thing. uh, and
I guess that's one way to put it.
I don't know. That's a presumptuous. Maybe you're not mentally healthy. I still haven't updated my title, but if there's anything you feel like I left out, then feel free to jump in and correct it.
I think sometimes it's just for anybody in here who has not met me before, sometimes I think it's helpful for people to know that I realize I don't look like a therapist, for one. Two, I have a PhD in human development, which informs a lot of the way in which I show up to these types of conversations and the things that I say. I also am a former assistant professor at Northwestern University. I am no longer an assistant professor there, but I actually teach graduate classes and have taught undergraduate classes before in the past as well. And I also have 3 years of volunteer experience on the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. So I feel like at this point in my career, I have a relatively well rounded experience of the mental health arena and have worked in a variety of contexts. So I'm not a one trick pony anymore, but um, it's on me to tell people when I can't answer the questions. So I don't mind any questions that come my way. It's up to me to tell you whether I can answer it or not. But Zine is, in fact, a good friend of mine as well. And I agree that we hit it off. And I got to give you kudos, as I did last time, for
What?
being somebody who I think is the embodiment of how a non therapist should be a mental health advocate. Like, I actually really admire the way in which you talk about mental health, share your own experiences, and provide so much support to so many awesome people. I have no doubt in my mind that the awesomeness of your community is partly due to that. And so you deserve a lot of credit too, as a non therapist. And just so you guys know, Zine says a lot of things that, like, as a therapist, I read and go, yep, that's awesome. So Zine's kind of like he could be a therapist if you ever wanted to go that direction, and I would endorse it.
I I've I walk the line there, and I never know because it's like one is I don't think I have it in me to go through and get a doctorate degree in order to reach that point. But there is definitely a huge interest for me in psychology and just the way that we work. And I feel like, there's a line of arrogance or hubris or whatever, but I feel like it's something that I kind of take to and seem to have a little bit of a natural strength to. And so I leverage that and try and use that in the community to help resolve disputes. Like that's one thing that I see a lot is just people in groups and particularly, communities as large as I've managed to get, drama between interpersonal drama can really tear those things apart, and that's something that I find that my management skills and my people skills really kind of come together and help. But I appreciate you saying that, and just it means a lot because actually that was something that I kind of like to kind of just start. That was something that I realized, and we might have touched on it before, but where I spend a lot of time in kind of that mental health world and thinking about it or dealing with people at that level. But I try and be clear about it, but I'm just kind of not making it up as I go, but it's my best uneducated guess, right? Like I think this
Yeah.
is what's going on. This is what I see. This is how you seem to be behaving. I don't know that I don't have a degree to back up my interpretation, and so it's one of the things that I've appreciated for you is be able to kind of in hindsight go to you with conversations and say, am I on track here? Am I on the right path? And do you agree? Understanding you can't weigh in with an actual assessment or anything like that, but if you're just kind of looking for that, and then I think, wait, that's validation seeking behavior, and then I go in this whole
Oh
cycle, and I don't know
God.
what to do. Like I'm so scared to ask, like, am I doing the right thing? Am I just seeking validation? Like, I think that's the one like phobia you've given me more than anything else. Is this just validation seeking behavior, isn't
Oh
it?
man. Well, okay. So I'm going to say this to you, but I'm going to also say because I'll bet you there are so many people right now in chat who are probably shaking their head, going like, uh huh, because I think a lot of people have started to worry about that as I've said it. Like, here's the thing: validation's okay. Reassurance from people is okay. Affirmation is a wonderful thing. I think we all need it in relationships.
I
The
agree with that.
operative word in that is excessive.
Ah,
And so it's when people do it because they have no other means of getting reassurance. Mostly what I'm saying with that is like self. So it's one thing to have a general sense of like, I'm going to use you as an example here. Like, you'll come to me and be like, "Hey, I did this thing and I want some thoughts and I'm wondering if you could help me out because I think I did a pretty good job." And I think the part of that that is so important is that I am then there to either confirm some level of reassurance that you've given yourself already because you're a pretty smart dude, you know what you're talking about, or like you're open to my feedback.
yeah, absolutely.
But the difference is if you came to me every single time and your entire sense of whether you did something correctly or not was completely reliant on
Right.
me, and as a result, you were constantly reaching out to me, even in the most minute ways, that's where that becomes problematic. So affirmation and consultation stuff is totally fine. It's excessive reassurance seeking that is basically reflecting a person is devoid of self reassurance where they're not getting confirmation for something they're already thinking as opposed to like, I'm living and dying by your acceptance of me, and that's a really dangerous spot to be in.
Right. So to restate that in what I would say is layman terms, or my interpretation is just that when people don't have their a strong enough sense of self or sense of self worth, that they then build and basically base their self worth off of the feedback that they've given, and it's that immediate feedback. So it's like I mean, the they're only as good as their last performance review on whoever they
Yes.
sought validation from. If I vacuumed poorly and you were like, "Man, you did a crappy job," and then I just feel terrible for the rest of the day because all that mattered was making you happy and I didn't meet your needs, then that's where it's like, again, you've got to have a sense of self to be if you're going to be happy. Otherwise, your other people are responsible for your happiness, and not only is that not a way to live very well for yourself because you're dependent on other people, but it also is like an unfair pressure on them to always be you're basically requiring and pulling from them an energy, in my opinion, where it's exhausting to have those people that are just like, did I do good? Did I do good? Did I do good? Like, again, there's a level
Yeah.
of affirmation. Absolutely, you did great. That's a fine feedback. But you come back the next time with, I did this too. Is that right? Yes, you know that. Like,
Well, and
yes.
that's where it gets even trickier because to use your vacuuming example, imagine you actually vacuumed well, objectively, but then you come to
Oh,
me
I do.
and I'm having a bad day and I'm just kind of in a shitty mood and I go, "No, you did a shitty job." And if you don't have the self-worth and some level of affirmation of self there to kind of try to have some context in the way you look at the vacuuming job, like you won't take my response into context. Instead, you'll personalize it. And personalization is a form of cognitive distortion. So if you over personalize it, now all of a sudden you've done a good job, but you're not reaffirming that for yourself because you're hanging by whatever it is that I said and not taking my stance into account. And it does get exhausting to the person who is constantly the one trying to reaffirm, which often means that they will distance. And then if you're a person who seeks reassurance from that person, you're going to keep chasing. And that's where you see this awful, what's called a positive feedback loop that I end up seeing in therapy constantly with couples. So,
And that's
not that we're a couples lead, but just to use that example.
it's fine. And that's isn't that a pretty common behavior though? Like, isn't that something you see in a lot of people where they don't have that strong enough sense of self-worth? Like, it's just, I mean, I
Mhm.
would say as a general, obviously there's people, and it probably, it depends on certain things, right? Like they can have a good, strong sense of self on things they know they're good at, but also be, constant, did I do good enough? Did I do good enough? And not believe in themselves on other things. So,
Mhm.
but I think I see that quite a bit as well as I kind of look at the community and as I watch people interact is just that like, be able to chart your course and to be yourself without necessarily needing that that those other people to lift you up, right? And
Yeah,
I get go ahead.
well, I mean, I can get kind of theoretical here for a second if you
Oh,
want and talk about a
theorize on me.
theory.
Do it.
Okay, so there's this theory that gets talked about a lot in couple and family therapy. The therapy model is called Bunyan therapy, but there's theories that go along with this. One of the theories that's in that is this concept called differentiation, which is basically where when we move into adulthood, there's this idea that we basically have to begin to acknowledge ourselves as being autonomous from the group. It's acknowledgement that we are simultaneously independent, but also part of a system and part of like microsystems within that big system. And the theory talks mostly about family relationships, but basically what differentiation says is that if you don't separate what emotional experience is yours from that of the group's, you will live and die by the group's anxiety because you will be fused to that anxiety, which means that like if you basically that example I gave where like I'm having a bad day and I'm angry and you come to me, if you will not separate my anger and frustration from your own sense of pride and may actually it will override your pride with my anxiety. And so one of the things I'm having to do a lot in therapy is help people differentiate from their systems of origin or the systems that they're currently in so they can recognize what their own emotional experience and their own assessment of a thing is and then compare that to the assessment of the system and then merge those two things together and see it with more nuance and context. So that's one big long fancy way of saying like that's another reason why it's really important to recognize how we are feeling about something and to engage in our own assessments of things so that we can recognize them as our own as the autonomous adults that we are. Harder for a child to do that, but in adulthood, that's theoretically an ideal that we're all working towards is differentiation. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
One of the things that that you'll get into at times, where I get left behind is you get into systems, and
Yeah.
you talk about systems a lot, and I'm not sure, like I'm not saying this is feedback. Like I love what you do, but I think anytime you start talking about systems, I don't know that many of us can keep up with that because that like most of us don't really think of personal interaction and person to person as a system per se. I mean, obviously there's rules unspoken and spoken and nuance and everything like that, but to define it as a structure and analyze it there, I think that's a very, I mean, obviously academic and educated way to look at it. I don't know that many of us are very good at identifying that. Is there anything that you would say like ways that we could leverage that or improve that, or is it really like no, you got to train to really kind of be able to identify those things?
Oh man. Dude, that's such a good question. I appreciate that question so much. Um
Thank you for that affirmation.
And actually good feedback for me too, because it is so innately in
Yeah.
my head at this point that it's always helpful to know that that can lose people. And actually the reason it loses like, there's a reason I had to go to school for 2 years to get a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, because that basically had to beat the individual, way of looking at the world that we're conditioned to look at the world as particularly in the United States out of me so that I could start to see things as embedded within interactions and within relationships. The best way that I could describe this to people is that you have to think about it as like almost like physics of how people's interactions work. Where basically, like for every interaction, there is an equal or opposite re-interaction that happens as a result. So if there's a way that you show up in a relationship, let's say, for example, I'm clingy and I'm constantly pursuing. I, as a systems thinker, as a marriage and family therapist, am also thinking about what is the systemic mechanism that reinforces and holds that in place. So I would look at the pursuing as serving some type of function in the relationship, meaning that it could be that the other person is distancing. So this person's response to pursue is because this other person is putting emotional distance, or vice versa. So, and looking at things as being in a context of interaction as opposed to just a linear thing that happens. So sometimes people critique that as saying like, "Oh, well, that means wouldn't that, Dr. Mick, mean that you're very victim blamey? Because it means that like if a person's in an abusive relationship, you're going to blame the person who's being abused for staying." And that is not true. But there is some level of systemic understanding for the way that those things work. And I think we have a much broader and better view of the world the quicker any of us can start to get into that mindset, of like, we are always embedded within relationships and systems. We're not individuals in vacuums and silos. Literally everything we do is interactional in some way. So it's just a once it clicks, it's this really like intoxicating way of viewing the world, but it is something that you basically have to train people to do because we're so heavily inundated with an individualistic idea of things in the United States, especially. So I can see how it would run counter. So I
It's
don't know if I did an ample job there describing it to you the way that you were kind of asking about it, but it is. I think it's a great way to look at the way the world works.
interesting. The and chat feedback was one, Honey Badger. I don't think you're supposed to be like, ooh, that's me when he's talking about the people showing up clingy. I don't think that's. I mean, just it's good to be able to self-analyze, but let's, and then people, saying, oh, so he's looking into my soul tonight. That's great. What's interesting though is you're talking about very, again, it's obviously not a linear thing because there's emotion and very non-rational forces, but at the same time there is a structure to it, and you're building it into a structure and kind of looking at it, the pieces and the interactions and stuff.
Yes.
I see that, like I see a lot of that, and what you're describing is it's like it's not what I do, but it's also describing the same thing where I know if you give this feedback, then that's probably going to evoke this response. And I mean, like A and B, but I don't have that perspective to structure it the way that you do. And so I can usually like want to, I can, I know the art of diplomacy of letting someone have my way and talking them through, okay, here's where you are, and here's how I'm going to let you decide to be where I want you to be, kind of thing. And I suppose that's all using that structure and stuff. It's just hard for me to visualize kind of it as defined as that, I guess.
Well, you've learned to do that and and navigate that based on prior experiences
Hmm.
in various relationships. Like you've sort of learned what works, what doesn't, how to kind of be in tune with how certain subsystems work. I mean, even from a streamer type point of view, right? Like there's the mod subsystem, there's the community subsystem, there's the lurkers, there's the people who chat often, there's the fellow streamers. Like even that, right? Like you sort of have to understand context because if you go in guns blazing in one area with a where it just doesn't make any sense, but there's others where you feel closer to and you've sort of learned that there are various reinforcement mechanisms there that make that more possible. I mean, you're literally changing your behavior as the result of the system in which you're embedding yourself in. And it's my job as a systemic therapist to look at that process and to be curious not just about you, but about that subsystem you're in, or why is it that this type of person brings this out of you versus other people bringing this out of you, and what makes you how do you choose to do that versus something else, right? Like
Right.
it's just it's a more complex way of looking at things, but I think it really expands uh our understanding of ourselves.
Right. Someone asked, I know it was Mary. I'm just looking for the comment, but they asked basically, how does anxiety factor into or affect those systems? And it's kind of a broad question, but
Oh,
is
it's a great one though.
okay.
That question actually probably didn't realize it, but anxiety is actually the operative emotional experience in the theory I was talking about. The idea is that as systems become more distressed or move through transitions together, there's an uptick in anxiety. And that when people experience anxiety, they will behave in certain ways that have basically been conditioned by their family of origin. And so, if people can't identify if the anxiety is theirs versus the anxiety of the groups or the anxiety of somebody else's, they'll start to act upon that anxiety in a way that may or may not make it worse as a result. So the role of anxiety is actually it fuels a lot. If you go with Bohemian therapy, like it fuels basically all of the interactions and all of the choices we make is a response to anxiety. And our goal is always to neutralize anxiety in that type of model so that people don't uh, feel it, even though I think that's a critique I have about that. But like that's why people will triangulate other people. And to break that down and not use the official term for it, like basically that would be like, let's say me and Zine get into an argument on stream about something and we disagree.
I don't
And
agree with
instead
that.
of so chat, what do you think about the fact that Zine just said that? So I just triangulated chat into a potential disagreement we had as a way to stabilize or what I think is going to dampen the anxiety between us in the dyad that we have. And we do this all the
Huh.
time in our relationships because we think if we pull in a third party, it's going to minimize the anxiety we experience. And in some ways it does. But what it actually does is holds in place the anxiety we have in the dyadic relationship. So triangulation is just an avoidance seeking behavior. So these are the types of things that people and families will do constantly without realizing it because it works. It's a reinforcement mechanism. So if I go to chat instead of to you, I don't have to deal with the intensity between the two of us, which means my anxiety goes down and I offload that anxiety to chat. And then chat has to carry that anxiety on my behalf. And then they will act in whatever way they're going to act in the response to the anxiety as opposed to me taking ownership and accountability for how I sit with anxiety and handle it and how you do. So that's one example of how anxiety can actually fuel problematic relationship patterns. So
Right.
I don't know. Cool stuff. I sorry, I know I'm
No, no,
going
no,
on and
no,
on
no,
about
no.
this stuff,
It
but I get
actually,
super jazzed about it.
that's great. Like the passion is interesting, and honestly, I did follow that, but I did have to laugh because there was a comment. Love how Zena's just staring at the screen like, "Hey, you lost me at hello." But no, I kept up with a little bit more than that. Um, so don't triangulate on your dyadic relationships as one shouldn't do. Is what we're saying. Like come on, guys.
Yeah.
Jeez,
Yeah.
get your shit together.
Especially if you are a parent and you triangulate your children into your co-parenting
Oh
relationship.
yeah,
Horrible thing to do.
right.
So,
So
and people do it all the time without realizing it.
So having launched kind of straight in because this is just to help chat kind of catch up. This is how Dr. Mick and I are. We just start talking and we just have fun. But you guys, I've set my send Zine a message reward to 1 point, so any one of you can send a message up. Keep in mind, please, we are going to have far more comments and questions than we are ever going to be able to answer, and there will be times where we just go off on tangents and just conversate. But you are a part of it, and if you have something you really want to try and get escalated up, again, you be keeping in mind I get swamped, and there's like
Yeah.
400 questions, and it's like I can do 20 sort of thing. So please be patient with us.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I really do appreciate you coming on, and particularly I think it's important. I mean, one of the things that we kind of started this with is just with all the insecurity, which translates to anxiety in the world to with the pandemic and the economic structure and everything like that. We originally kind of had that conversation of just how are ways to try and cope with anxiety. That was the motivator for starting this. And now I find myself, I believe, different from last time in that it's a little bit more of a personal question. How does one handle job loss? And seeing their life's
Yeah.
work disappear in front of, but I mean, that is something like, again, you've talked about, and I apologize if I'm butchering this, but you've talked about anxiety is based off of insecurity. It's fear of the future and the unknown, right?
Yeah. It's your brain's
Or lack
response
of
to the unknown.
a feeling of non-security, not like insecurities, but
Yes.
the unknown and
Uncertainty would be the better word.
fine,
It,
okay, Mr.
well, no,
Vocabulary.
but I see what you're saying. we'll encapsulate it in uncertainty. That would
I don't
probably
use
be
these big words like uncertainty. Okay, it's just next you're gonna be like, he pulls
the
out
weird.
triangulate my dyadic relationship over here. Chat, what do you think of him correcting me on this right here? But
No, chat. Don't answer him. Don't answer that, chat. Tell me how you feel about it.
oh,
Don't tell.
don't. Wow. Okay.
What I love about that though, dude,
Hmm.
is that what that probably just did. I'm sure because I know it would happen if I was watching. Is that probably pulled some kind of emotional response out of some people in chat? And if you sit with that for a second, that is partly your response to being triangulated. And that's actually a really good thing to be able to recognize is what it feels like to be triangulated, because then you can detriangulate yourself. So anyway, as you were
Chat
saying before we
chat
got into the
said,
whole uncertainty
Zine,
thing,
fight your own battles. All right, fair enough.
way to go, Mary.
But
Proud of you.
but anyway, that's how, like, we'll try and use this, send a message and to try and catch up on stuff, back and forth. And I'm just gonna hop around, grab messages. If I miss yours, I'm sorry. Um,
Zine,
but
was you mentioning the job loss thing? Like, were you going somewhere with that?
I was making it. It was a poor attempt that I kind of aborted halfway through. But I was joking because I did lose my job between our last conversation and this one. So it is a little more of a personal thing. But I'm not.
Sure.
I feel like I'm handling it okay. But what was interesting there, and to kind of, I mean, one is there's like 20% of people are dealing with it right now. Like unemployment, at least in the U.S., which is where all my, but it is reaching into the 20% range, like levels not seen since the Great Depression kind of thing. And if you think about that, that's a that's an insane number of people that are dealing with job loss right now, and the inherent insecurities or uncertainties, if you will, that come with that, and just whether it's not knowing how to pay your bills, or how you're going to survive. And first off, keep in mind, guys, and I realize it's just it's very nebulous, but things work out. We figure it out. We get through things, and it takes work, and there's tough times, but we get to the other side of these moments. And so, at the very least, in a broader sense, we get to the other side of the river, and stop getting water up our shoes. I don't know the metaphor. It's just a bus under the bridge at this point. But I love.
You took me, and that was a ride. That was a ride. Like I
I
could
love
feel
doing
myself
that.
trying to grasp what I was. Geez, then you threw the bus under the bridge, and like,
Just
oh my god,
the mixed metaphors. I love doing it because it makes
that was so good.
people think
I
that they're like, yeah, wait, what?
Wow,
Because
I
you
wasn't
think
awake. I
you
am
think
now.
you're along, and then you realize you're not. But one of the things that, I mean, just I tell people, if Dr. Maker covers, one of the things that I advise people is either look higher or look lower if you're in that point where anxiety is overwhelming you. And it depends on what your reaction to anxiety is. But basically, if it helps, look at the broader picture and see that we've been through difficult times. We've been through all this. You've been through difficult times. Maybe not specifically what's happening, but you've been through hard times, and you come out on the other side, and you come out, probably stronger, more experienced, more capable. And so, it's all temporary. And when you realize that those many of those concerns you carry with you moment to moment, and that you worry over moment to moment, they just don't fucking matter in our life. Like, yeah, we need to handle it, and we will, but it's not really something you're going to remember a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, whatever that time frame is, because they're small, short-term concerns and stressors. And so, if it helps you, then look kind of past that and rise above it. Alternatively, if the more you look at the bigger picture, the more anxious you get, or the more uncertain, or overwhelmed, then for me, it's compress that worldview and come to only work on the things that you can handle right now. And that might be, if you are at a full flooded, can't cope state, it might be just focusing on your breathing from moment to moment. Like, I mean, I've had times in
Mhm.
my life where I've come down to that. I'm just going to get to this next breath. I'm going to get through these next two. And you just, as you kind of recenter and regain yourself, then you start bringing in and bringing more of your life back in. But you can shut out down to where it's like nothing else matters. Just breathe, and then as you regain that coping ability, then you kind of start factoring in things, and you just handle it as you raise, as you expand back open. So that is a very general sense to just kind of talk about, what I see in these times is if you were came out like, hey, I'm just really stressed, I can't handle what's going on, that would be my advice. Just at the top without needing any sort of what's happening with you specifically, like just a general coping mechanism. Um, and then I guess, do you wish to affirm or deny that particular perspective, or perhaps just expand upon?
Doing it again.
I know. That's fine.
No, it's okay. I'm just trying to make you a little more paranoid. No,
No,
you're
no. Wait, I'm
I
paranoid?
no, no.
Or am I?
We'll get there. Um, I no, and what you're saying is actually very true. I have had to have two. So I'm going to kind of weave together two things that
Mhm.
you started talking about because I've had to have this conversation a lot with people lately, both professionally and just in personal life. Um, to address first the like control what you can control thing, that is 100% excellent advice because what we tend to do when we are in a position like this, especially in the pandemic here, is like we live either in the past or in the future. People tend to go in either direction because it's a little bit less intense than the present. So they will usually go to back to the past mentally to try to manipulate the past and ask a whole bunch of what ifs. What if I had done this? What if this had happened? What would I change? And really, that's futile because you can't change the past. Like that is a fact. I've never met a person who was able to go back in the past and change it. So it's a frame that you want to take on looking at the past is what can I learn from the thing that I'm paying attention to that was in the past that I can choose to utilize in the present. The future is a bit of a tricky one too, because if we spend too much time in the future, it takes us away from the choices we have to make in the present that will actually inevitably lead to what's going to happen in the future. Like the future only is an amalgam of choices we make in the present. So what Zine's saying is 100% true because what we want to focus on right now is have your your focus directed toward what you can control, what you can influence. In a lot of ways right now that's yourself. And if it does get down to the micro level of taking breaths or taking a shower or whatever it is that you got to do, super important to do that and focus on what you can control in the context of things that are uncontrollable. So if you lost your job and you didn't have control over that, then focusing on what can I control right now to move through this process so that I can either move toward whatever goal I have, whether it's to find another job or to kind of weather the storm here. But what are the choices I can make as opposed to sitting and waiting for other things to make choices for me? With that, Zine, I want to say too, like as I'm sure there are people in chat that have also lost their jobs right now, and I know you have too. Is like we have because in the United States we have this tendency to be so focused on what people do. I mean, often the first question people ask when they're getting to know somebody is, "What do you do?" We're not even just talking about people losing a job. We're talking about people losing a sense of identity
Mm-hmm.
and losing a big chunk of how you answer the question of who you are. And that cuts super deep for a lot of people. And if there's anxiety and sadness and grief or whatnot that comes along with that, that is totally normal and common and is worth paying attention to because it is more than just, oh, well, I shouldn't be so bummed. Like you probably have lost, not you, the collective you, have probably lost some sense of your identity and are feeling lost in that. And that's a really scary and vulnerable place to be. And most people aren't prepared for that in the way that, you can prepare for losing a job, but most people don't prepare for losing a chunk of their identity. And so a lot of patience and self compassion is super important with this. And controlling what you can control will help ease some of the anxiety that comes along with that.
And I feel that what was interesting is I was like, I'll be done, around 9:30 or whatever, and you were like, oh, I can't make it till 11, and that's, I mean, it was just like, okay, let me figure out what to do with the time. And so I just kind of chatted with chat, and they got me off on some programming rants and things like that, where I was talking about experiences from my job. And honestly, there were a couple of points where I was giving an opinion or something that it's like, I know that my opinion is valid. I know that it's right. I know that, like I have many, many years of experience, but there's some part of me that's like, and I just got let go. So does that mean that I was wrong? Does that mean that I don't have it, any places like, again, and that's that sense of identity that you're talking about, I think, of just, like that invalidation per se
Hmm.
of, I mean, I had 16 years there. I'm pretty sure I did a decent job, and it was a financial thing that they looked at, and they're like, well, you've been here for so long that your just yearly raises and stuff like that have made you to where you're a very prime candidate for promoting to customer. And so it
I
really did.
oh, man, I haven't heard that saying in a long time. I that just
I promoted to
I don't
cut.
mean to laugh, but
No, no,
oh
no.
my
You're,
god,
you're
I
totally.
I heard that so long ago, and I've never thought about it since, and you just saying that.
The one that I like, I heard that, I think I picked that up from chat, but the one that I went with initially was they invited me to seek other opportunities. Um,
Ah, yes. Mm,
they encouraged me strongly, but like you were saying, it's very uh, dehumanizing is a little bit dramatic, but it's you lose that sense of you, you lose a
sure.
part of you, and I don't know whether it's American culture and different on other places, but it's very that your job is very much a part of who you are and how you define. I mean, for us, it's basically a third of our life. Um,
It's time. I mean, it's
and
that's what it is. It's
it
time. You've
and
sunk a lot of time.
but one of the things that really stood out to me that was just like I was not expecting this is, or I guess a couple things. One is that I knew that it was a race between me and my employer. Like I was aware that it was either I was going to quit or they were going to let me go for a couple reasons. One is that my passion was long gone, and so I wasn't that
Mm,
exceptional of an employee at that point. I knew my stuff and I knew exactly what to do, but I knew exactly how much I had to do to without exerting myself in any sort of way and then getting through my day because I didn't care about it. And so in that regard, no part of me disagrees with their decision, but we had kind of gotten to this point where it's like I had set a date of this is when I will be leaving, and I was trying to work to it, and I was about 6 weeks away because my 5-year stream anniversary is coming up, and I wanted to announce on that day that
oh, man.
I had put in my 2 weeks notice 2 weeks before, and the day before, like that was my grand plan, and I just felt that was a nice symmetry or whatever, and they screwed it all up, and that's fine. But only 6 weeks or so from
Yeah.
where I had planned to quit anyway to here. So I had lined things up and was, like on the financial side, it's difficult, of course, but I have this as an out, and I had, had been lining things up. And yet what really struck me is just how much I still like it was devastating in many ways. Like this is someplace I had lost interest in, didn't want to be, didn't look forward to going to, and was actively working to leave. And when they were like, just right there at the tail end, just kind of, okay, here, let us give you that final nudge. It was like, you son of a bitch! What? What?
Yeah, right.
Excuse me? Like, hello? And like, I went through. I don't know. It was literal stages of grief, but
Yeah.
I went through this. It was hard to accept. That I was angry at them for various reasons. I didn't really bargain with anyone. I just kind of like, okay, well, this is how it is. But like it's a hard thing, and it was just amazing to me how I was probably in one of the most prepped positions possible, and to alliterate heavily, but I was
Mm,
in about as good of a position as you could be, and it was still so tough. So for all of you people who are dealing with it, just my heart goes out to you. And again, keeping in mind, I saw someone mention earlier in chat that advice from the high school teacher, but they'd said you've overcome 100% of the problems you've encountered so far, which is kind of a cool way to look at it. But yeah,
yeah.
we'll get through this, and there will be another side. But man, it's amazing how hard that hits you, and how, again, maybe it's just American culture, but being in the middle of American culture, it's kind of been part of my life. It was much heavier than I expected it to be.
Well, I mean, we also like control. Like, there is a beauty to the idea that you had this thing set up, right? Like,
Mhm.
this was going to go in this way, and it built this beautiful set of expectations for yourself and all these things. And then all of the autonomy that was wrapped up in that got stripped. And I mean, that happened for so many people through this, and is continuing to happen for people. And as I've talked about before, the human brain does not do well with having our experience not align with our expectations for
Right.
things. And there is this, like, it is devastating. If for no other reason, it's that FU thing is because of, like, where was my I had all my autonomy, and you took all of it away from me, and that is bullshit. And it's okay to be upset about it. It really is. I think there's this cool balance, I think, that a lot of people can reach. And having talked with you a bit, I think you seem to fall in that, which is people have to be really careful not to overly contextualize the things that happen to them as a way to remove the emotion of that, because I think sometimes people will go like, well, it was a pandemic and it was this, and some people have it worse, and thus I shouldn't be upset about it at all. And I think that's also not great because it moves people away from really paying attention to what's going on for them. So I think it's a healthy dose of both of this is in context. Things will get better. I will overcome, but also it totally sucks. And I can hold space for that too because we don't want to you don't want to deny both. You or one or the other. You sort of want to hold them both at once. Sometimes they don't jive very well, but I just think that's so important. So
Someone from chat asked, "What if to counter anxiety, you just pull away from people? How will that affect?" Which is an interesting one. I don't know that
oh
I'd know how to answer that because, like, pulling away, like that's to me a depressive behavior, but it's a depressive behaviors usually aren't a response to an active like that one hits on both anxiety and depression. And as soon as you get into the
yeah.
anxiety level, I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about anymore.
So it's actually a really great question because it brings back, I mean, I'm going to go bounce back to that theory. So I talked about triangulation as being one method of trying to stabilize anxiety or mitigate it. Well, cutoff is another dynamic that gets talked about. Cutoff in the form of separation, which basically means I'm going to put a huge amount of space between me and you because I believe that if I do that, it's going to diminish the anxiety I experience in the dyad. So if we got in a fight and then I said, you know what, dude, I'm out. We're not talking anymore. I'm going to end the stream. I'm going to end my role in the stream and then I'm out. That is a form of cutoff. And that actually does not mitigate anxiety. It just stabilizes it. So what's going to happen is the next time we engage, if we do, that anxiety is still going to be there, or that effect is still going to be there. And a lot of people don't realize that when they go to initiate cutoffs, they think they can just kind of return and be fine, but it holds it in place. It also holds it in place mentally. So your last mental image of that person or that system is what you cut off from. So it becomes kind of what you mentally operate off of in the absence of that person being around. So it stabilizes the anxiety, and I don't mean stabilize in the good way. I mean stabilizes and holds it in place. And so the theorist Bowen said, "Don't cut anybody off." That has since been kind of like reworked of like you can cut people off, but it's to effectively cut a person off takes way more cognitive and emotional effort than people realize. It is not as easy as just ending it. So if you ever want to cut somebody off, I highly recommend talking to a therapist about it or getting some real good support about it because it's not as easy as you think. And the last thing I'll say about that is this is rarely talked about is death is also a cutoff. So a lot of times when people experience a significant amount of grief in the context of death as it relates to anxiety, it is because the death stabilized whatever anxiety loose ends were not tied up before the person died, which can also really impact a person's grieving process. So that's why another example of like why I cut out, like when people get a chance to mourn the death of a person before they die, they generally will handle grief a lot more effectively than if it's a sudden thing because it holds everything in place all of a sudden. So cutoff is not any better than like triangulation or enmeshment. It's a dynamic that generally doesn't do people as well as they, or doesn't help people as much as they think they're going to.
So more, I kind of hear that at least with on the death side is that's the what people would say is the lack of closure, right? You know, you had a
Hmm.
fight and then they die, and then you have all this extra anxiety
Yep.
or emotion because the fight is unresolved and now it can't ever be resolved, and so it's just like it's stuck there. It's almost it. What's it? That's interesting, but that's almost like a phantom limb pain kind of thing.
Hmm.
I wonder.
Oh, that's a good metaphor.
That's interesting. I
Yep.
like that just lined up, and I was like, but um, God, it's cutting people off is very traumatic. But like, I see people pull away a lot, and then they go through episodes where it's like they pull away and then they come back, and they pull away and they come back. And I actually have people that I almost have to just account for that, allow for it, right? Because it's
Hmm.
they'll be I'll talk to them and they'll be mad at me, they'll be cold, they'll be pushing me away, and then it's like I just kind of all right, this is where you're at. And then given a day, given a few, they'll kind of come back, and I don't know why I was like that. I To me, that's more depressive episodes, isn't it? Or is that is there a number of different things there where you'd have to kind of more assess to figure out why they're triggering that?
Yeah, I mean, a depressive episode could certainly be an explanation for why a person's doing that, because I do like when people do go through depressive episodes or through depression, they tend to isolate
Hmm.
themselves. So that is certainly a possible explanation. I tend to look at it, I tend to look at it from more of an attachment perspective in terms of like people basically operating from their attachment style, which I can go into if you want, but basically like we look at it as a regulation of closeness and distance. And some people feel more uncomfortable with closeness, and some people feel more uncomfortable with distance. And so they will regulate as such. So people who sort of snap back and forth as a therapist, I'm looking at them saying, okay, so one of those spaces, the closest in distance, is creating a significant amount of anxiety for you. And you are compensating for that by doing X thing until some other factor then contributes to you making the choice to reach back out. And there's a lot of explanations for that. But yes, a depressive episode could certainly be that. Anxiety can be an explanation of that. Sometimes it's healthy to do that. Like we do need to have space in our
Sure.
relationships. But I think if it becomes this real significant pattern and you can see these nodal instances of like an uptick in anxiety or distress that leads to that, that's where, as a therapist, I'm going to poke in on that and really try to get a feel for the pattern there and why that's happening, so that not so that the person can necessarily stop doing it, but so that the person can see doing that as an informed choice as
Right.
opposed to something they're just reacting to.
That's interesting. It's been and I'm thinking of a couple different individuals that I specifically work with and or talk to. Work with sounds professional, but I mean, just try and help. But
Mhm.
it's a little frustrating just because I don't know how to help them other than just remain their friend even through that. Like I know that they don't want the friendship to actually end. They're just it's whatever's affecting them, making them push back, and that in a few days they'll reconnect and apologize and stuff like that. But I just that's one of those ones that it's like that I hit those points where I'm like, God, I wish that this is where I wish I had that training where I wish I could. I want counselor slash psychiatrist. I mean, I don't know which one's not psychology. That's medicine, right? Or is it psychiatry?
Psychiatry is medicine.
Okay, so psychology, like I want that training. It's just I don't want to have to deal with all the extra stuff around it, whereas I have to actually make that my job, right? Like I just want to know all about it. Is that fine? Can I just go audit the
Yeah,
classes, not pay for any of it, and
dude, I gotta tell you, in a lot of ways, and I really mean this, I actually envy sometimes the position that you're in as it relates to psychology, because there's this thing that happens where the more credentials you get, the farther away you get from being able to use it in personal context. Like, there are so
Hmm.
many times where I wish I could employ what I know, but I can't
Oh,
because I ethically am not able to.
right.
So this is where you get this really interesting thing that happens, where you are not part of this group because I think you actually are mindful and care about what you're saying and you say good things.
I tried.
But there are people who can just dole out mental health advice and say whatever they want, and there's no accountability for it because they're not held accountable by any type of ethical code or any license or anything like that. So sometimes people get frustrated with me when they ask questions or whatever, and I don't answer them or I say I can't answer them. And it's not because I don't want to. There are many times where people reach out to me and I would love to answer it because I could see it. Like I could be like, I know exactly what's going on. But because I'm a therapist and because I have an ethical code and a license, I can't do that. So I envy sometimes the position you're in to be able to dole it out and to say things and to go there with people, because I have lost my ability to do that in my personal life. And that's a really odd experience to have, to think about mental health stuff all the time, but not necessarily be able to like operationalize it other than in general terms.
Right.
So,
That's interesting. I mean, it makes me think like there's several friendships or I mean they develop into friendships and stuff, but people come and ask advice or I get talking with them through the community, through the streams and stuff. And it just, you made me kind of realize like there's many of those you wouldn't be allowed to do. You'd have to shut down like almost immediately, where I'm like, tell me what's going on. I don't know,
Mhm.
like, and I mean, obviously I try and make it clear I'm not a therapist. I'm just here as a friend. But I think that's what you're getting at, right? It's just that, I mean, again, these are people that I talk to, that I care about, and have just gotten to know through the community, because they've said I'm having a hard time, and I'm like, tell me about it. What's going on? Well,
Yeah.
here's what I think, and do with it what you will. I'm not claiming coming to you as a doctor, but because you are a doctor, you don't have that luxury.
Well, because most people will come to me and ask me those types of things because they know I'm a
Right.
therapist. So if the whole context of the conversation is because you know that I'm a therapist and that's why you're opening up to me about whatever it is you're opening up to me about, my hands are tied. But that, again, that's where it's like it's on me to identify those things. But I do my best to give general info and to
Right.
like, yeah. But yeah, that's, I think what you're talking about is something that so many people, not even just streamers, but like people deal with, right? Is like people come with these very complex things. And it's like, how do I handle that? How do I help? And I say a lot, and I say this to anybody who's watching this right now. Honestly, most of the time, the very best thing you can do is just listen. Like, literally, just don't even think about how you're going to respond. Just put all of your effort into hearing what the person has to say and validating whatever emotional experience they're having. That goes so far for people, but my God, Zine, it is one of the hardest things I can ever get people to do when I am doing therapy. Like, it is the gateway to problem solving, it's the gateway to a better relationship, to health, like so many things. But people just struggle so hard with doing that because so many of us feel like we have to respond, like we have to fix, like we have to help, like we have to understand, like all these things. People will talk if you just listen. And I would guess that the reason so many people are comfortable talking to you is because you do that, because you are curious and you listen. And it goes so far. So anybody watching this, seriously, if you ever ask yourself, how do I help this person? Unless it's an emergency, just listen. Like, just listen to what they have to say.
And I thanks. I mean, I actually catch myself doing that, so I appreciate you saying that I am good about that. I really do try and listen, and particularly like I am very comfortable in writing, and so if you can write at me, then I can really craft a message and kind of send it back, and hopefully I can change the tone to match to where I understand, or at least hopefully, ideally, understand, here's how much I can say without them getting defensive. Here's all those lines and stuff, which is kind of strange. People tell me, you can't, this is segueing, but people tell me you can't tell tone through text, like, oh man, people type and that's why the joke got lost is it's just, and it's like, no, it's just a bad joke. Like I pick up, I can read text
Yeah.
in your voice just fine. Like I hear inflections and stuff.
Yep.
So, although I will say that there is like I couldn't give you an actual percentage, but to make up a number, like probably 1 in 25, 50 or something, where they talk, or they type monotone. And that is the most aggravating thing for me, because I'm that. If you want to ever see me have that, like, be neurotic, like, how are you doing? Checking in, affirmate, like, are you okay? Are we, it's because you end every sentence without, or you start every sentence without punctuating. You end every sentence with an ellipsis, and so I'm just like, "Are you okay? Talk to
Oh
me. I
man.
don't understand."
Oh man.
I had my ex brother-in-law literally would finish every sentence with an ellipsis, and so it
Oh.
was like, "Do you want to go to the movies this week? We could. Dot
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 dot.
dot
What do you
dot
want
dot
to?
dot.
Sure. Dot dot dot. Well, do you
Oh
or
my
don't you?
god.
Like,
Oh my
fuck. I
god.
can't. Oh my god. But that's
Dude.
not nothing to do with mental health other than losing mine. But
When I
being
was in college, that's how I used to type to people. So my laughter is because it drives me crazy now, but also because that was me back in the day. Anytime I wanted to convey a pause, I would use an ellipses, and I realized it was a terrible idea.
So
Way too late.
Kara just did the multiple lines for every sentence, but that actually is a tone. It's just the hyper excited. They're so there's two reasons that people do that. One is that they want to try and pace their cadence in their words so that you read the lines, and I do that sometimes for dramatic effect.
Hmm.
But they're trying to do that. But mostly it's because they're so excited about what they want to say, or they're so worried that the conversation is going to leave without them that it's like they're trying to get it in. So it's that almost neurotic
Yep.
interjection basically. So I actually pick up tone and can understand a little bit where they're coming from with that. But the ellipsis kills me unless it's used correctly. Guys, I'm just saying, just take it. Stop it, Kara. But um, she's freaking Kara, man. I tell you.
I
I
love it.
actually, it's interesting, Commander Victoria. I discourage the use of that because it is based of re because it's based off the sounds that an autistic person makes when they're frustrated, and like we on our channel it kind of, and I'm not saying this like to taking you to task, but just more conversationally of we trying to not allow that because it is slightly derogatory of people who are in that frustrated space, and if you look at kind of what's the etymology? What's I can't remember the root of the word or the source of the phrase. I guess it's not really a great place. So it was just caught me by surprise that you were using it, but maybe you just don't know. Like again, I'm not trying to call you out like wow or anything, but I don't know if that's commonly seen or if it's just a quirk here or not. But we try and avoid it.
It's good. It's one of those um, that it's so interesting because it's one of those things that like has been, I think, adopted so many times
Yeah, it
over.
could have been that it's lost. It's been watered down to the point where it's not really.
Well,
Or
but it's also like I'm agreeing with you in a lot of ways. Like it's sort of a weird thing. Like there's a lot of things that happen. I think we do this a lot with I'll kind of make a broader point here is of like we do this a lot with mental health stuff where when a person says like, "Oh, I like when my desk is clean and I'm so OCD about it." Or
triggered
if
is
a
another
person
one.
says, like, "Oh man, like I have such PTSD from like that one time that this happened or whatever." Like there is we throw some of these very loaded terms around um without real, and I don't see people doing it like in some manipulative way or like
No,
some bad thing, but like we throw some of these things around really casually, and it's like you hear it with physical stuff too, and like that always, like when people are like, "Oh man, yeah, like that community is like literal cancer, like that can't that they're that's AIDS." Like I just it's so weird when we use some of these like terms like this to, because I get it, it's like a way of hyperbolizing things, but
hmm
it's just, I don't know, it's making a point about that. Like I really encourage people to be mindful about using that type of language. Like I get why people do it, but especially the OCD thing. As somebody who works with OCD a lot, I, OCD is utterly debilitating. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's not like, "Ooh, I'm so quirky because I like my plants arranged a certain way." It is literally a mental hellhole to
there
be
is.
in.
I would say. I mean, I agree. Not to. I mean, I listened. I understood. Just so you know, but. I read someone saying even mild stuff like that's lame, and I think that there's a point where you have to accept the conversation and vocabulary and language is going to happen. So it's like for me, it's I try and be better. I try and educate, but on thoughts. But at the same time, like I try not to take offense, like particularly because it doesn't necessarily apply to me. But also, like I would encourage everyone, don't. Language does evolve and co-opt words and bring things in, and so again, try and be better for yourself, but try not to be so hypersensitive that you're offended on others'
Oh yeah.
behalfs because you hear that like again, that there's a line there where you have to. I mean, just make a personal decision, but it's more about for me just understanding it and educating and going, okay, then I can remove that from my vocabulary, but not I'm upset at you because you used it.
Yeah.
Um, Powerful and meaningless at the same time. I agree. You're talking about listening and the best thing that it can do to kind of rewind just a little bit though. One of the few things which is that I went through is my old job was based out of the Franklin Covey headquarters. It was their business park in Utah, and that's the seven highly habits of highly effective people.
Yeah.
And so we all got sent through, or at least all the managers got sent through the training there, which honestly it wasn't. It was different, but it wasn't terrible training. Um, and they talked about two things that I kind of carry with me. One of which is the circle of influence, circle of concern. I think we talked on that last time of
Hmm.
trying to recognize these are the things, the broader things, the number of concerns you have in life, and then you have the smaller circle within that of things you can actually influence. And the closer you can get to having those be aligned, the less insecure and anxious you're going to be because you're only worrying about things you can actively influence.
Hmm.
But the other thing one of the things they talk about is listen to understand, not to respond, which is
Yep.
basically restated what you were saying of, you know, we hear things and it's someone will be telling a story and I'm very vulnerable or guilty of this myself, but someone will be telling a story and it'll trigger a thought, a response, an idea, something as you were listening to them to where you start formulating how to add on your thought, your response, your idea, etc., to the conversation or in response. And during that entire time that you're figuring out the right words to say, the right way to say it, the right way, how to make it funny, how to make it
Yep.
interact, you've stopped listening to the other person. And that's to kind of expand just on that further is you get into your own head of how am I going to respond to this? And again, it's very very easy to do. I've done it several times just in us as you've kind of been talking. I'm like, okay, I need to remember that this is the next thing, and that this comment was funny, so let's bring that up. I mean, I'm part of that's just trying to run the show and everything like that, but really being mindful and particularly in a one-on-one conversation, as you said, that's just one of the most helpful things. Is people just want to be understood. They want to know that others care and that there's what they're feeling is, as you said, valid. You go out of your way to a point that is, for me, I tease you about it and it's slightly comical, but in terms of validating everything you hear to make sure that people understand, I hear you, I understand that affected you, and I don't disagree
Hmm.
that it should have affected you, and like again, it's to a point where it stands out to me because I recognize that sequence of events. But that really, as you've been saying, that's just something that for people who are hurting or people who are lost, that's what they're looking for is just please just listen to me for a minute. You don't need to tell me how to fix my problems, or maybe at the end they can, um, you can have that conversation of what would you like me to do about it, but they're
Hmm.
just looking to be understood. And that's helped me a lot as I've worked with people as well. And sometimes it'll be when they'll start and they'll be like, I have a question or I have this problem. What do you think? And I might ask a question like expand on that, but I'll actually preface it with, are you looking for me to just validate you, to just tell you that you're right, that you should be upset? Are you looking for me to help you with this? Like, and it's a very awkward part of the conversation, but you get better at it as you get used to it. But I really do go into certain things like, wait, what are you looking for? Are you just looking for that?
Hmm.
Yeah, that dude sucks. I can't believe they did that, which is something that a lot of people do. And
Yep.
it isn't great in and of itself. There are times when it has its place, but really, you get just a feedback loop of let me tell you my bitch story, yeah, and let me tell you my bitch story, yeah, and then you just work yourselves up into a tizzy
Yeah.
over nothing, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you are talking, I guess to kind of put a point on this, if you are talking to someone, if you are dealing with someone who you know and love that is struggling, and you're trying to be that best person or that most present person for them, then just listen to them. Try and understand what they're saying and what they're feeling. Don't worry about your reply. Worry about what they're saying. It really is a very different way to listen. I think
Hmm.
it's also called active listening, or maybe that's slightly different, but kind of that same idea of you are trying to understand them. You are not trying to craft your perfect pithy response. You know, so.
Absolutely. I mean, if anybody's wondering, like, how do I do this? Like, if you're sitting here going, like, how do I be an active listener? I'm gonna tell a quick story about when worked on the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which was also a crisis center. I used to do overnight shifts, but when we did training, it was this long 39-hour, or no, it was more than that. It was a very long training. I forget how many hours it was at this point, but it was multiple weeks and multiple hours, and it was sequenced in the same way that you would sequence a phone call when somebody would call in. So you're sitting at the crisis center, somebody calls in, you have no idea what that person's about to say, but you know that they're in crisis and you know that they're having a hard time. So you answer, you say hello, and you start talking to the person. And the very first thing that we're taught, it was the first training, was empathy. How to show empathy to somebody. Empathy being using some idea of your own personal experience, but paying more attention to what the other person's experiencing and reflecting that emotional experience back to that person. We have this really awful tendency to do that by telling stories about a similar experience we had, and we often do that as an attempt to empathize with people, but it takes away from what's going on for the person. Instead, it's you I hear a hint of frustration, so I might say something like, "Well, it sounds like you're frustrated about that." And you don't use minimizers or maximizers. People tend to go, "You sound a little frustrated," or "You sound very frustrated." It's, "You sound frustrated about that." And if you're right, people will go, "Yes, I am. I'm frustrated," and they'll keep going. If you're wrong, people go, "No, no, I'm not so much frustrated, more as I'm sad." You like literally win no matter what you do when you make an attempt to empathize with a person. But as you do that through a conversation, you reflect, like, it sounds like, so just to use an example, Zine, like, it sounds like you lost your job, that it sent you into, there was a lot of emotions that went on. It sounds like that was really tough for you and it really had you scrambled. I used a maximizer there, but uh, that would be an example of empathy, right? So, like, I haven't actually said anything to add to the conversation other than responding to what you've said. So that's empathy.
Hmm.
The next step was, after we got people to empathize and practice that, you move to values, which is where you then try to get a sense of what core values are driving that person's emotional experience. So asking questions about, so what is it that made you frustrated about it? Tell me more about how sad you are about that, and why that's the case and what's going on for you, and trying to get at that. And then the third step was problem solving. So you would literally never even go into problem solving until you first had empathized and you had some idea of what values were driving that. You would do that really in any call except for like an utter emergency. And it changed the way that I viewed listening, because it made it so that when people called the center, they would open up to a complete stranger because I was doing those things. So imagine how powerful it would be if you're in a relationship where you know the person and have a deep connection with that person, and they do that.
Right.
People will usually tell you if they want you to help them solve their problems, but they got to know that you understand where they're coming from before they're even going to listen to what you have to say about how to fix their problems. So it's a very long, drawn out way, but I think sometimes I get that question of like, how do I do that?
Hmm.
And it really is like as simple as reflecting what you're hearing and showing through verbal and nonverbal nods that you understand what that person's saying to the
Right.
best of your ability.
Do you guys? I've heard you, at least as far as I understand. If you'll excuse the term, misuse. But do you guys ever cover sympathy versus empathy and the real differences
Yes.
between them?
Yes.
I mean, to me, like, and maybe I have it wrong. As far as I'm aware, and have understood it, empathy is being able to directly relate to someone's experiences, where sympathy is being able to, like, you don't have that direct relation, but you're still feeling for them even though you can't directly relate. So one is like, I have empathy if or you would have empathy for me if you've also lost your job and you can relate, whereas you would have sympathy for me if you recognize that you haven't lost your job or haven't ever been through that, but you see how that would be affecting me. Is that am I misinterpreting that? And so but I've always thought of it as just empathetic is more of a direct, or empathy. When I'm feeling empathy for someone, it's I can directly relate to that, versus sympathy,
Hmm.
whereas I can assume or interpret and how you're feeling, even though I haven't dealt with it myself. Is
I
that
would say that's pretty good. I would add a very like important piece of this though,
okay?
which is that sympathy often comes with it a value judgment. So, um,
Hmm.
empathy is kind of like you draw from your own experiences, but you are also paying attention to cues from the other person and kind of trying to synthesize those things so you can understand them. Whereas sympathy is usually a little bit more of, I'm going to place some degree of judgment using a form of inductive reasoning for my own life to try to get a feel for what it is. Like, it's a little bit less collaborative,
Right.
and it's a little bit less drawing from your own experience. So, like, pity is often a word that's used synonymously with sympathy, and I think pity is kind of the extreme version of that, where a person's really just, placing that like value judgment of like, oh, like you should be so devastated by this, and like I feel so bad for you in my high and mighty throne or whatever. But sympathy, I think, usually has this like evaluative component to it that goes unsaid, whereas empathy is really this like, hey, we're on an equal plane here, and I'm really just trying to understand what's going on for you. Um, so like if you say to somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, so and so in my life died," and you go like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." That's sympathy because you're basically making some judgment that that must be sad or bad in some way, and so I'm gonna convey this to you, as opposed to so and so died, you go, "Wow, like, how are you doing?" Is like that, that did it catch you off guard? Like, right? It starts with a question, and then a person starts talking about it, and you go, "Wow, like, it sounds like you're confused about why this happened this way. It sounds really difficult for you." And you go, "Yes." Right? Like, I'm sort of drawing upon what my idea of a difficult situation would be using context clues, whereas
Right.
sympathy is just an immediate, like, response.
Interesting. So empathy is more just a bit about building that feeling and that response based off of what the other person is feeling, where sympathy is more you assuming how they've got to be feeling in that
Mhm.
moment, kind of.
Mhm.
One's more of an assumption and as you said, a judgment. And also, apparently, offended all the empaths in the chat who were like, "Excuse me, sir,"
Yeah.
but all right. Well, I mean that.
Sympathy gets a bad rap, but it's not bad, it's just it
I mean,
doesn't usually cut as deep as empathy does.
right, and I think that you're still. I typically sympathy isn't. In fact, I mean, sympathy generally isn't going to be coming from a place of negative intention. It just might not be quite as directly applicable because you're presuming how it is instead of exploring how the other person where they genuinely are.
Mhm. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so, okay, well, now that we've taught everybody how to work at a crisis center and listen to people, um, you want to try and roll through some comments, or
Yeah, yeah, no, we can go wherever. I'm just enjoying the
I'm
conversation.
I'm
I
enjoying it
also
too. Like I was looking at, it, I was like, man, we're like 70 minutes in. You're gonna be like, oh, I'm at the wall here in 10
no.
minutes because you can't stay up later than 10 o'clock your time or something like that. But without getting,
Somebody hasn't been watching my streams lately, guys.
oh,
I was up till
oh.
3 a.m. last
Were
night, my
you?
friend.
I
Oh,
was
yeah,
I was
I
I
got
was in your stream like 4 days ago and you 12:30 on the dot and you're like, "Guys, I can feel it coming. I can't even go on." Like it's just
uh I know.
uh
I was you must have well, I forget what day that was. No, I got energy tonight. I'm good to
nice.
go.
Nice. Good to go.
So,
All right.
yeah,
I'm
no wall
this
early
is
this
this is
night.
I mean the colors are lost, but these are Red Bulls, so I'm good to
Oh
go.
my god. Careful, they give you wings.
I mean, but in strange places, not where you'd expect them. It's very weird. Let's not
Um,
talk about it. Um, I mean, I'm just saying, I've got lift, but not lift off. That's different. But bro, SpaceX sending people to the moon or to the moon to the orbit here in like 3 days. Gonna be awesome. Coming back, reeling it in.
oh, good.
Uh, you can't handle me. I love it. I'm just all over
Dean's
the
a funny
place.
guy, man. I mean, you're a funny dude. I gotta say.
How how do you regain
Goddamn.
control when you end up in a state of extreme emotion? I find it hard to take myself out of the heat of the moment. That's an excellent one.
It is.
I mean, that's probably a coping mechanism I'd leave for you more than me trying to jump in on that.
I'm gonna use a term that gets thrown around a lot, but then I'll explain what it is. Grounding is a very important thing, which is basically where you have to draw your attention to the present moment and things that you can tangibly experience. It doesn't have to be touch. Sometimes people think it means you have to be touching something. But if you pay attention to like your feet on the floor, your ass in the chair, your the cool air on your hands and face, whatever, that can be helpful. Sometimes it's like staring at a clock or staring at a certain point of reference. I used to have a poster in my bedroom it was a Pink Floyd poster, and it was, as you can imagine, pretty crazy and all over the place. And if I was ever really
Well,
angry, I used to
depends on which
count.
album.
It was like an amalgam of all of them. It was
Oh,
like this triangle, and it had these hexagons in it. It was trippy. But I used to like focus on that if I was ever really distressed because it would help me, and I'd try to find something new every time. That was really helpful. Breathing is super important. When we have an explosive emotional outburst, what happens is your sympathetic nervous system fires, and it's where you get all those like the tinglies and the jolts, and your endocrine system sends a whole bunch of hormones out, and you get adrenaline rush, all these sorts of things. So your goal in that moment is to engage your parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to calm you down. And breath is a very common and easy way to do that, which is the in through the nose, hold out through the mouth thing. But grounding also engages that. And then you got to give it like 15 minutes for your endocrine system to flush all the crap out of your body, because sometimes people think they have to just snap back, and it's not going to work. Hormones take a longer time to move through your body than a nervous system response. And so you'll have this residual feeling afterwards. But it's all about grounding, having building a better relationship with your emotional experience, so that if you're angry or anxious or whatever, you can acknowledge that as just an emotion without any value judgment on it, because that's what we tend to do, and that compounds it. Having a good relationship with your emotions, that takes long work, but then grounding, focusing on the here and now, selective focus on various things that are interesting to you or will bring you back into the present, and going from there. That's the best I can say without having done a full assessment
Right.
on a person and their response to an emotional outburst.
Right. And I mean, it's all better stated of the things that I would cover too. So I don't really have anything I'd add to that. Just again, like you said, for me, extreme emotional response. You narrow the view until you can handle what you're dealing with. If you're out of control, that's which again,
Mm-hmm.
a much smaller response. How do you know when to go to a therapist versus a psychologist?
Well, if you want to get into like the technical terms of it, a psychologist is just somebody who studies psychology. They don't necessarily have to be a therapist, but psychologists can be therapists. I think what that question is probably asking is, how do I know what type of therapist to go see?
Hmm.
Which is dependent first and foremost on how many people you intend to have in the room, and also what your objective is. A psychiatrist is the only person who can prescribe medication. So if you're thinking the medication route, or you think you have some very severe psychosis, you're going to want to go the psychiatrist route. If you want to be assessed for something like autism or ADHD or something like that, you're going to want to go to a clinical psychologist or a psychological counselor. Usually, the LPC is the acronym or the initialism that's used for that. Um, if you have multiple people that you're going to have in the room, then a marriage and family therapist is the route you're going to want to go, because they're trained to think systemically in the way we were talking about a little while ago. If you're needing like extra resources and care from the community and some like uh, intervention in like schools and just a lot of coordination, a social worker is going to be the route that you're going to want to go. Like a clinical social worker is going to be more helpful to you. But um, that would be the best answer I have in terms of like how to figure out what type of person to go see. There's also like licensed mental health counselors. They're also okay to see. Just make sure, for the love of God, you see somebody who has an actual credential. Do
Should they go
not,
to a life coach?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Do not go see a life coach. Life coach is not a protected term. There is no code of ethics. This is going to soapbox me, so I'm going to hold myself back from going too crazy on this. But uh, it's not a protected term. I'm sure there are okay life coaches out there, but you take a massive risk as a client if you go to see a life coach, because there's a good chance that person has no training and is only using what they know or what they've read in pop psychology. And I've seen too many people in my life that have been harmed by life coaches or have gotten horrifically terrible advice from life coaches, all who were well meaning, but who have no code of ethics. So if you have a life coach do something really crappy and tell you something shitty and you go do it and it causes harm, there is no accountability there. They are not held accountable to anything. So please, if you have them, there are affordable counseling options out there. And if you ever need help finding somebody, come find me, because I try to help people find therapists in their area that they can afford or whatnot. Like, there are ways to get affordable therapy. Do not see a life coach. That's all I'm going to say about life coaches, because I will soapbox so hard on that, unless you want me to
Well,
soapbox.
no,
But
I,
oh my
I
God.
don't, I know. I just poke the bear. But it is interesting, like, and we've kind of talked about this, and you've, I don't know, reaffirmed or whatever. But every time you describe that, like, that is uncomfortably close to some of the realm that I kind of live in, and so I'm like, and I hope that I'm not hitting in that area, but I'm not
You aren't.
credentialed. What's
I
that?
just you aren't. You are not even close. Like, I gotta tell you, the reason that's so problematic is because it's because people don't know. There's so many people who will see like certified life coach or some bullshit like that, and they think it's legitimate. So they will go see that person and pay them money because they think that that person is basically a therapist, and they aren't. by definition they aren't.
Presenting themselves as
You
credentialed in some way.
Correct. You are a streamer, and people know that, and they know that, like, or you're a friend, or you're a family member, or whatever. So, like, it's completely different. You are not misleading an entire group of people into talking to you because of some credential you have that they don't, and understandably don't, know is problematic.
Okay.
So, I just want to make sure you know what you're
And
doing
like,
is
but
not
you
even
you can
remotely
understand,
close.
like, I mean, where
I
you try
can.
and listen and stuff, like you go into that, I'm like, oh shit balls. But
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, I do try and be very clear. You know, I'm not a doctor. Please don't please don't listen to anything I say. Basically, this is if this is like really quick, then I wouldn't mind. I'm kind of curious about the answer, but if it's
Mhm.
involved, then I think it's very specific. So we probably spend time elsewhere. Can you explain the difference between OCD and OCPD? This person's therapist said that they have
Oh,
OCPD versus OCD, and if that's like big and involved, and I don't think it involves many people, so I'd probably rather spend our time on more
yeah.
generalized concepts than something like minute and specific.
Oof. Yeah. So, what I would say just about that, first of all, if to whoever asked that, if your therapist diagnosed you with OCPD, basically it's obsessive compulsive personality disorder as opposed to just obsessive compulsive disorder. Um, there is the main. I'll give the one difference, which is that, like, you kind of is the common thing to think of, which is that person will often try to impose that their compulsions on the external environment as opposed to kind of holding them internally. Like, they basically, like, will make it other people's problems. I don't mean that in the way that it sounds. Like, it's got that it's extra relational component that becomes a very consistent thing that happens in the relationships. The thing I would say, though, just to kind of wrap that one up, is to the person who asked that, if you are confused at all about that diagnosis and are like, what does this mean and how is this different or whatever, ask your therapist. Because if they did an assessment and know the difference enough to have made that diagnosis, then I would hope to God that they were doing that. I'm sure they were in an informed way. Ask them. They had damn well better be able to answer that question. If your therapist can't answer why they diagnosed you with whatever they diagnosed you with, that is a massive red flag, like, huge red flag. So ask your therapist.
I couldn't have even told you the difference between the two. So, slight differences between the caliber of your hosts, guys. What's that? So.